The throne room went silent the moment the candles flared without wind. King Damian Ashgrove stood at the center of the marble floor, his hand still raised from the blood ritual, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. Every noble, every guard, every servant in that hall turned to look at the same thing he was staring at. A girl, a slave girl, with a wooden bucket still gripped in her trembling hands, standing frozen in the doorway, where she should never have been. Her eyes were brown a heartbeat ago. Now they burned gold, bright as struck fire, bright as something ancient waking up after a long sleep. Luna Serafina felt the air leave her lungs. She had stood beside Damian for 3 years, as his wife, his queen, his bonded mate, in name only. She had smiled through cold dinners and colder nights, had ruled beside a man who barely looked at her, had told herself that duty was enough, because love was not something kings like Damian gave away. But she had never once considered that the bond everyone believed they shared might not be a bond at all. Damian took one step forward, then another. The court watched their king, a man known across the land for his iron control, walk toward a slave girl, as though she were the only person left breathing in the world. "Please," someone whispered. "Please let this be a mistake." It was not a mistake. The old stories said a true mate would reveal themselves through the eyes, gold overtaking the natural color the instant the bond ignited. No one alive had seen it happen. It was a legend told to children, a story grandmothers used to explain why some marriages felt hollow and others felt like fire. And now, in front of 300 witnesses, the legend stood in a servant's doorway, holding a bucket of dirty water. Ren did not understand what was happening to her. Her chest burned as if someone had lit a coal beneath her ribs. Her vision sharpened, colors turned bright, and every sound in the room became too loud. The rustle of silk, the creak of leather boots, the sharp intake of breath from dozens of strangers, all staring at her, like she had grown a second head. She wanted to run. She had wanted to run every day since the soldiers dragged her from the ashes of her village 2 years ago. But running had never worked before, and something told her it would not work now. King Damian stopped an arm's length away from her. His golden eyes, the mark of an alpha born to rule, searched her face with an intensity that made her knees weak. Up close she could see he was younger than the stories made him sound, and the coldness people whispered about him did not show in his expression right now. What showed was disbelief. What showed was hunger, though not the kind that frightened her, the kind that confused her more. "Ren," he said, and the sound of her own name in his mouth felt like a stranger reading her diary aloud. She flinched back, and the bucket slipped from her fingers, water spreading across the polished floor in a dark stain. No one moved to stop it. No one dared move at all. Damian turned from her slowly, as though it physically pained him to look away, and faced Serafina. His wife of 3 years stood at the base of the dais, in her ceremonial blue gown, her spine straight, her chin lifted, refusing to let the entire kingdom see her break. "I release you from the bond of Luna," he said. His voice carried through the hall without effort, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. From this moment, Serafina Ashgrove no longer holds the title of Luna to the Ashgrove kingdom. A collective gasp rippled through the nobles. Someone dropped a goblet, the crash of metal against stone the only sound besides Serafina's controlled breathing. "You cannot do this in front of the entire court," Serafina said, her voice shaking despite her effort to keep it steady. 3 years, Damian. 3 years I have stood beside you." "And in 3 years," he answered, "not once did the bond show itself. Not once did my wolf recognize you as anything more than a stranger wearing a crown. I ignored it, because duty demanded it. I will not ignore this." Serafina's eyes filled, though she refused to let the tears fall in front of the court that had once bowed to her. She looked past Damian to the slave girl still standing in the doorway, soaked from the spilled water, gold eyes wide with something between terror and confusion. "This is not her fault," Serafina said quietly, "but it will not be forgiven either." She turned and walked out of the throne room without another word, her guards trailing uncertainly behind her, unsure whether to follow their former Luna or remain at their king's side. The doors shut with a heavy, final sound that echoed through the silence she left behind. Damian faced the crowd. "Clear this room," he ordered. "Everyone but the girl." The nobles filed out in a slow, whispering exodus, casting glances back at Ren, as though she were a ghost, that had wandered into their world by mistake. Servants gathered up spilled goblets and mopped at the water on the floor, none of them meeting her eyes, some of them refusing to even acknowledge she existed anymore, as if speaking to her now would somehow curse them too. When the hall emptied, only Damien, Ren, and 2 silent guards remained. Ren wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her servant's dress was, how exposed she felt standing in the center of a room built for kings. "I do not know what just happened," she said, before he could speak. "I was bringing water for the kitchens. I was not supposed to be in this hall." "I know," Damien said. His voice had softened, though the golden intensity in his eyes had not faded. "You felt it too. I could see it in your face." "I do not know what I felt," she answered honestly. "My chest hurt. Everything got too bright. That is all I know." "That is the bond," Damien said. He took a slow step closer, giving her room to step back if she wanted to, and she did, putting several feet of distance between them before he stopped moving. "I have heard stories of this since I was a child. 2 wolves, born for each other, recognizing their match the instant their paths cross. My father told me it was a myth used to comfort weak alphas who could not find contentment in arranged bonds." "Then he was wrong," Ren said flatly, and something in her tone must have surprised him, because his eyebrows lifted slightly. "You do not sound pleased," he said. Ren let out a short, humorless laugh. Pleased. She looked down at her ragged dress, at the calluses on her hands from 2 years of scrubbing floors and hauling water. "I am a slave in your kingdom, my king. 2 years ago your soldiers burned my village to the ground, because we would not pay a tax we did not owe. My mother died trying to protect what little we had. My father disappeared into your dungeons and I never learned what became of him. And now you stand here telling me the universe has decided I belong to you. Forgive me if I do not fall to my knees in gratitude." The guards behind Damien shifted uncomfortably, clearly expecting their king to strike her down for such disrespect. Instead, Damien's jaw tightened, something like shame flickering behind the gold in his eyes. "Which village?" he asked quietly. "Willowmere," she answered. "Does it matter now?" "It matters to me," he said. "That campaign was ordered while I was recovering from injuries sustained in the northern border conflict. My council acted without my direct command. That does not excuse what happened, but I want you to know, I did not order the death of your family." "Does that change anything?" Ren asked. "My mother is still dead. My father is still gone. I am still a slave standing in a room I was never meant to enter, being told by the man responsible for my kingdom's destruction that I am somehow his fated match." Damien was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tall glass windows that lined the hall, the only witness now to a conversation neither of them had wanted to have. "I cannot undo what happened to your village," he said finally, "but I can promise you this, you will not return to the kitchens. You will not be treated as a slave in this palace for 1 more hour." "I do not want your pity," Ren said sharply. "It is not pity," he answered. "It is recognition of what you are to me, whether either of us wanted it or not. The bond does not lie. My wolf has never reacted to another living soul the way it reacted to you, the moment your eyes changed." Ren wrapped her arms tighter around herself, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hours of kitchen work behind her. "I do not know what you want from me," she admitted. "I do not know either," he said, and for the first time since she had known of him only through frightened whispers among the other servants, he sounded almost human. "Give me time. Give yourself time. I am not asking you to love me. I am asking you not to disappear into the kitchens and pretend this did not happen." Before Ren could answer, the tall doors at the far end of the hall opened again, and a young woman in a healer's robe rushed in, her face pale with worry. "My king," she said, bowing quickly. "Forgive the intrusion. Word has already spread through the palace. The staff are saying the Luna has left her chambers and taken nothing with her. Some say she rode out through the eastern gate not 10 minutes ago." Damien's expression darkened. "Alone?" he asked. "With 2 of her personal guards," the healer answered. "No one dared stop her, my king. She is still your wife by law, until the council formally dissolves the bond." Damien ran a hand through his dark hair, frustration evident in the tight set of his shoulders. "Send riders after her," he said, "not to force her return, but to ensure her safety. Whatever has happened here tonight, I will not have her come to harm on the road." The healer bowed again and hurried out to relay the order. Damien turned back to Ren, who had used the brief distraction to put even more distance between them, retreating almost to the far wall. "You should go after her yourself," Ren said. "She was your wife for 3 years. Whatever I am supposed to be to you, she deserves better than watching you send someone else to check on her welfare." "I will speak with her when the time is right," Damien said. "Tonight, my priority is ensuring you are safe and settled somewhere that is not a servant's quarters." "I do not need your charity," Ren repeated, though her voice had lost some of its earlier edge, exhaustion creeping into every word. "It is not charity," Damien said again, gentler this time. "It is what should have happened the moment you were brought to this palace, as a captive of a war you had no part in starting. I failed to see it then. I will not fail to see it now." He gestured to one of the silent guards, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, who had remained respectfully near the door throughout the entire exchange. "Torin," Damien said, "escort Ren to the West Wing guest chambers. See that she has proper clothing, food, and anything else she requires. No one is to bother her tonight." Torin bowed and looked toward Ren expectantly, waiting for her to follow. She hesitated, glancing once more at the king who stood alone in the center of the vast throne room, looking, for just a moment, less like the fearsome ruler the entire kingdom feared, and more like a man who had just watched his entire understanding of his own life crack down the middle. "Thank you," she said finally, the words feeling strange in her mouth after 2 years of speaking only when spoken to. She turned and followed Torin out of the hall, leaving Damien standing beneath the flickering candlelight, staring at the space where she had been. The West Wing guest chambers were larger than any room Ren had ever slept in, larger even than the entire home she had shared with her parents back in Willowmere before it burned. A soft bed piled high with blankets sat beneath a tall window overlooking the palace gardens. A wash basin of warm water waited on a stand near the door, and a simple but well-made dress hung from a hook on the wall, clearly prepared in haste, but with more care than she had received in 2 years of servitude. Torin lingered at the doorway. "If you need anything through the night, there is a bell pull beside the bed. Someone will come." "I do not want anyone watching me," Ren said, more sharply than she intended. Torin's expression softened. "It is not for watching," he said. "It is for your comfort. His Majesty gave clear instructions that you are a guest here now, not a prisoner." Ren said nothing, and after a moment, Torin bowed and left, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The click of the lock, or the absence of one, she noted with some surprise, told her something important. The door was not locked from the outside. For the first time in 2 years, she was in a room she could leave whenever she wished. She sank onto the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the soft blanket, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Her eyes had changed. She had seen it reflected in the polished metal surface of a nearby shield as she stood in that doorway, brown eyes replaced by something molten and gold, something that did not belong to the quiet, invisible girl she had trained herself to be since the day her village burned. She thought of her mother, of the way she used to tell old stories by the fire about fated mates and true bonds, stories Ren had always assumed were just that, stories, pretty lies told to children to make an unfair world seem a little kinder. She thought of her father, wherever he was, whether he was even still alive somewhere in this same kingdom that had just declared her bonded to its king. And she thought of the coldness in Serafina's eyes as she walked out of that throne room, a woman who had done nothing wrong except exist in a bond that was never real, now cast aside in front of the entire court because of something Ren never asked for and could not control. None of this was fair. None of this made sense. But sitting in that soft bed, in a room she had never imagined she would be allowed to sleep in, Ren realized something that frightened her, more than the gold in her eyes, or the king who claimed she belonged to him. For the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt seen. And she did not know, not yet, whether that was a blessing or the beginning of something far more dangerous than anything she had survived so far. Outside her window, the moon rose high and full over the Ashgrove kingdom, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, Serafina rode hard into the night, her heart broken, but her mind already turning toward questions no one else had thought to ask. Why had her bond with Damien never shown the golden fire the old stories promised? Why had 3 years of marriage produced nothing but cold silence between them, when even ordinary arranged matches sometimes grew into something resembling affection? Something was wrong, and Serafina intended to find out exactly what, no matter what it cost her to uncover the truth. Back in the palace, Damien remained in the empty throne room, long after everyone else had gone, staring at the spot where gold had bloomed in a stranger's eyes and changed the entire course of his kingdom in the space of a single breath. He had ruled for 6 years, without ever feeling the pull the old stories described. He had begun to believe, quietly, privately, that perhaps he was simply not built for it, that some alphas were destined to rule alone, bound only to duty and the crown. Now he knew otherwise, and the knowledge sat heavy and strange in his chest, equal parts wonder and dread. Because the girl the fates had chosen for him was not a noblewoman raised for the throne, not a warrior trained to stand beside a king, but a slave girl carrying grief and anger his own kingdom had caused. A girl who had every right to hate him, and yet had looked at him tonight with something that was not quite hatred at all. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know how his council would react, how the kingdom would respond, how Serafina's powerful family would retaliate against the public humiliation of their daughter. He did not know if Ren would ever choose to stand beside him willingly, or if she would spend the rest of her days resenting the gold that had marked her as his. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The candles in the throne room burned low, and somewhere in the west wing, Ren finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with fire and gold and a mother's voice telling old stories, by a hearth that no longer existed. Morning would come, and with it, questions neither of them was ready to answer. But for tonight, the kingdom held its breath, and the fate of 2 people, who had never asked for any of this, began quietly, irreversibly, to unfold. Ren woke to the sound of birds outside her window, a sound so ordinary, it took her several confused seconds to remember why waking up felt wrong. There was no bell calling her to the kitchens before dawn. There was no ache in her shoulders from carrying buckets up 3 flights of stairs. There was only soft morning light, spilling across an unfamiliar room, and the memory of gold eyes reflected in polished metal came rushing back all at once. She sat up quickly, half convinced the previous night had been some fever dream brought on by exhaustion, but the soft dress still hung on its hook, the wash basin still sat filled with water gone cold overnight, and the door, when she tested it, still opened freely at her touch. It had been real. All of it. A knock sounded before she could decide what to do next. A young woman entered, carrying a tray of bread, fruit, and warm tea, her eyes darting nervously toward Ren, before dropping to the floor, in an automatic gesture of deference that made Ren's stomach twist with discomfort. "You do not need to look away from me," Ren said quietly. "I am the same person I was yesterday." The young woman, who introduced herself as Ellen, glanced up with visible hesitation. "Forgive me, my lady. No one is certain what to call you now, or how to behave around you. The whole palace has spoken of nothing else since last night." "I am not a lady," Ren said. "I do not know what I am, honestly. Just tell me your name and treat me the way you would want to be treated. That is all I ask." Ellen's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time she offered something close to a genuine smile. "Ellen, my lady. I have worked in the palace laundry for 4 years." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I remember you from the kitchens. You always shared your bread with the younger girls when the head cook was not looking." Ren blinked, surprised that anyone had noticed such a small thing amid the daily grind of servitude. "I did not think anyone paid attention." "Everyone paid attention," Ellen said. "You were kind when kindness cost you something. That is rare down there." The simple honesty of the comment settled something anxious in Ren's chest, a small reminder that whatever strange new world she had woken up into, she was still the same person who had shared bread with frightened children in a cold kitchen. She thanked Ellen for the food and ate slowly, trying to gather her thoughts before whatever the day intended to throw at her. She did not have to wait long. Barely an hour after she had dressed in the simple gown left for her, another knock came, sharper this time, followed by the entrance of an older man in formal robes, who introduced himself as Alaric, chief advisor to the crown. His expression was carefully neutral, though Ren could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a stove. His Majesty requests your presence in the private council chamber, Alaric said. There are matters that must be discussed regarding your position within the palace. Wren followed him through corridors she had only ever seen from the servant passages before. Corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Ashgrove ancestors staring down at her, as though judging her right to walk beneath their painted gazes. The council chamber, when they arrived, held a long table surrounded by several older nobles, who fell silent the moment she entered, their eyes tracking her with a mixture of curiosity and open suspicion. Damien sat at the head of the table, and something in his posture eased slightly when he saw her, though he did not smile, clearly aware of the tension already thick in the room. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to an empty chair near his own. Wren sat, aware of every eye in the room following her movements. An older woman, with sharp features and silver-streaked hair, spoke first, her voice clipped and formal. "My king, forgive my bluntness, but the entire court is in uproar. You have publicly humiliated the Luna, a woman from one of the most powerful families in the northern provinces, in favor of a girl with no lineage, no dowry, and no claim beyond an eye color that changed for reasons none of us fully understand. The bond is not something I chose, Councillor Dorena," Damien said evenly. "Nor is it something within my power to reject once it has manifested. You know the old laws as well as I do." "The old laws were written for a different time," another councillor added, a heavy-set man with a deep frown, carved permanently into his features. "Fated bonds have not been confirmed in this kingdom for over 2 centuries. Some scholars argue the entire concept is little more than folklore, given weight by desperate rulers seeking justification for personal desires." Wren felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication, the suggestion that whatever had happened to her the previous night was somehow a convenient excuse, rather than something entirely beyond her control. She opened her mouth to object, but Damien spoke first, his voice hardening in a way that made even the councillors sit up straighter. "I felt it," he said simply. "Not one of you stood close enough to witness what passed between us in that moment. I have ruled this kingdom for 6 years without ever feeling anything close to what happened when her eyes changed. I will not have my own counsel question the legitimacy of something I experienced directly." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Councillor Dorena's gaze flicked toward Wren, assessing her with an intensity that made Wren want to shrink into her chair, though she forced herself to sit up straight instead, refusing to be made smaller than she already felt. "And what of Lady Seraphina?" Dorena asked. "Her family will not accept this quietly. Lord Hensworth has already sent word demanding an audience with the Crown by week's end." "I will meet with Lord Hensworth personally," Damien said. "Seraphina's dignity and safety remain my concern, regardless of what has changed between us. But I will not pretend the bond did not happen simply to preserve political comfort." The meeting continued for what felt like hours, discussions of formal announcements, of how to present the situation to the wider kingdom, of what protections and titles, if any, would be extended to Wren going forward. Through most of it, Wren said very little, feeling increasingly like a piece on a chessboard being discussed, rather than a person with thoughts of her own, until finally, she could not stay silent any longer. "May I speak?" she asked, and the room quieted, several councillors clearly surprised she had a voice at all. "Of course," Damien said quickly, before anyone else could object. "I do not want a title," Wren said. "I do not want announcements or ceremonies. 2 days ago I was scrubbing floors in this same palace, invisible to everyone who now cannot stop staring at me. I understand that something happened that none of us can explain, but I will not be paraded in front of a kingdom that watched my village burn without lifting a hand to help. If you want my cooperation in whatever comes next, I ask only for time to understand what any of this means before you decide my future for me." The heavy-set councillor opened his mouth as if to argue, but Damien raised a hand, silencing him before a single word left his lips. "She will have that time," Damien said firmly. "No formal announcement will be made until she is ready. This council meeting is concluded." The nobles filed out slowly, several of them casting long, assessing looks at Wren as they passed, though none dared voice further objection in front of their king. When the chamber finally emptied, Damien remained seated, watching Wren with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly, once the door had shut behind the last councillor, "for speaking your mind in there. Most people in this palace have learned to say only what they think I want to hear. I am not most people," Ren said. No, he agreed, the faintest hint of something like admiration in his voice. You are not. Over the following days, a strange new rhythm settled into Ren's life within the palace. She was given her own modest set of chambers, separate from the guest room she had first woken in, along with a small allowance of new clothing that felt foreign against skin accustomed to rough servant's cloth. She was not required to attend court functions, not yet, though she often felt the weight of curious and hostile stares whenever she walked the palace corridors, whispers trailing in her wake like a shadow she could not shake. Some of the whispers were cruel, calling her an opportunist, a girl who had somehow manipulated ancient magic for her own advancement, though anyone who spent even a few minutes in her presence could see how little she wanted any part of the attention now surrounding her. Other whispers were softer, kinder, servants who remembered small kindnesses from her years working alongside them, who now looked at her, with something closer to hope than resentment, as though her sudden rise proved that fate could still surprise even the most powerless among them. Damien, for his part, kept a careful distance, clearly mindful of how overwhelming everything must feel to her, though Ren noticed he found small reasons to seek her out nearly every day. He would appear in the palace gardens, where she had taken to walking in the early mornings, claiming he simply needed fresh air himself, though the timing rarely felt coincidental. He asked about her days, about small things, what she had eaten, whether Ellen had been kind to her, whether the guards assigned to watch over her respected the boundaries she had set. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, and slowly, despite every instinct telling her to remain guarded, Ren found herself looking forward to those brief morning conversations more than she wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Serafina had not returned to the palace, and word filtered back through various channels that she had taken residence at her family's estate in the northern provinces. Her father, Lord Hensworth, reportedly furious over the public humiliation dealt to his daughter. Rumors swirled that Hensworth was gathering support among other noble families, who felt threatened by the sudden elevation of a former slave to a position of influence within the crown, though nothing concrete had yet emerged beyond tense whispers and closed-door meetings. Serafina herself, however, was not spending her days in idle mourning. Within her family's private library, she pored over old texts related to mating bonds, fated pairs, and the mechanisms by which such connections were said to form. She had never once, in 3 years of marriage, felt anything resembling the golden-eyed transformation described in the old legends, and something about that absence nagged at her with growing urgency the more she read. Her personal maid, Ophelia, who had served her since childhood and remained fiercely loyal, despite the scandal now surrounding her mistress, found her late one evening, surrounded by stacks of ancient texts, candles burned low around her. "My lady, you should rest," Ophelia said gently. "This will not undo what has been done." "I am not trying to undo it," Serafina replied without looking up from the yellowed pages in front of her. "I am trying to understand why it never happened for us. 3 years, Ophelia. Not once did Damien's eyes so much as flicker when he looked at me. Not once did my own wolf recognize anything beyond duty when I looked at him. If fated bonds are real, and last night proved they are, then why did ours never manifest? Perhaps you simply were not meant for each other," Ophelia offered carefully. "Perhaps," Serafina agreed. "But arranged matches happen every day in this kingdom. Matches built on political necessity rather than fate, and most of them eventually grow into something resembling genuine affection over time. Ours never did, not even a flicker. I want to know why." She turned to an ancient passage describing the rituals used to formalize bonds between powerful families, rituals that had fallen out of common practice over the centuries, but were occasionally still performed for matches deemed politically vital. Her finger traced along a faded line, describing herbs and oils, used to suppress a wolf's natural instincts during formal binding ceremonies. Substances that could, according to the text, mask the absence of a true bond long enough for a marriage to be legally sealed. Her blood ran cold as she read further, understanding slowly dawning with a horror that made her hands tremble against the brittle pages. "Ophelia," she said quietly, "bring me every record my father kept from the year of my binding ceremony. Every single one." "What are you looking for, my lady?" Ophelia asked, clearly alarmed by the sudden shift in her mistress's demeanor. "I am looking for proof," Serafina said, "that my own father sabotaged the truth of my bond with Damien before I ever had the chance to discover it for myself." The implication settled heavy in the quiet library. candlelight flickering across pages that suddenly felt less like ancient history and more like the beginning of a conspiracy that had shaped 3 years of Seraphina's life without her knowledge or consent. If her suspicions proved true, then everything she had believed about her marriage, her role as Luna, and the reasons behind her recent humiliation would need to be reconsidered entirely. Back at the palace, Ren had begun to notice something strange developing within herself over the following week, subtle shifts she could not fully explain. Her senses seemed sharper than before, sounds and scents more vivid than they had ever been during her years as an ordinary servant. She found herself instinctively aware of Damien's presence even before he entered a room, a faint pull in her chest that intensified whenever he drew near, though she refused to acknowledge what that pull might mean. One evening, walking alone through the palace gardens after most of the staff had retired for the night, Ren became aware of a presence following her at a careful distance. She turned sharply, expecting a guard, or perhaps Damien himself, but instead found herself facing a stranger, dressed in dark traveling clothes, his hood pulled low over his face, his stance carrying the unmistakable readiness of someone trained for combat rather than palace service. "Who are you?" Ren demanded, backing away toward the nearest lit pathway, her heart pounding with sudden alarm. The stranger raised his hands slowly, showing he carried no visible weapon, though something about his careful movements did nothing to ease the tension coiling through her. "I mean you no harm," he said, his voice carrying a faint accent she could not immediately place. "I have been sent to observe, nothing more. But I would advise you to be careful, girl with the golden eyes. Not everyone within these walls wishes you well, and some threats do not announce themselves as clearly as an angry council meeting." Before Ren could demand further explanation, the stranger melted back into the shadows of the garden hedges, disappearing so quickly and so quietly that she began to doubt her own senses had registered him correctly at all. She stood frozen for several long moments, her pulse racing, before finally turning and hurrying back toward the safety of the lit palace corridors, the stranger's cryptic warning echoing uncomfortably in her mind. She did not tell Damien about the encounter that night, uncertain whether doing so would help or simply add fuel to tensions already burning too hot throughout the palace. But she found herself sleeping poorly, jolting awake at small sounds, increasingly aware that whatever strange new world she had been thrust into carried dangers far beyond simple court gossip and disapproving stares. The following morning, Damien found her in the gardens earlier than usual, and something in her expression must have betrayed her restless night, because his own face immediately creased with concern. "You did not sleep well," he observed, settling onto the stone bench beside her, closer than he usually allowed himself to sit. Ren hesitated, weighing whether to share what had happened, before finally deciding the stranger's warning felt too important to keep to herself, regardless of the complications it might create. "Someone approached me last night," she said quietly, and recounted the encounter in careful detail, watching as Damien's expression shifted from concern to something darker, more focused. "Describe him again," Damien said, and Ren did her best, though the darkness and the stranger's careful concealment had left her with frustratingly little detail beyond his accent and his obvious training. Damien's jaw tightened as she finished. "This is not the first strange incident reported within the palace since the ceremony," he admitted. "2 of my guards reported unfamiliar footprints near the servant entrances 3 nights past. I dismissed it as nothing significant at the time, but combined with this, I am no longer willing to assume it means nothing." "You think someone is watching me?" Ren asked, though the answer felt obvious even before he spoke it. "I think," Damien said carefully, "that your sudden importance to this kingdom has not gone unnoticed by parties who may not have the kingdom's best interests, or your safety, in mind. From this point forward, you will not walk these gardens alone, not until we better understand what threat, if any, we are dealing with." Ren wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take care of herself after 2 years of surviving as a nameless slave in a palace that had never cared whether she lived or died. But something about the stranger's careful, deliberate warning had unsettled her more deeply than she wanted to admit, and she found herself nodding in reluctant agreement instead. As the days continued to pass, the strange mixture of danger and unexpected tenderness that now defined Ren's existence within the palace walls continued to deepen, each day bringing her closer to a truth about her own past, and about the kingdom that had claimed her, that she was not yet prepared to fully understand. The healer arrived at the palace on a gray morning, summoned from a distant village known for its knowledge of old bloodlines and forgotten histories. Her name was Marin, an elderly woman with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see far more than they let on. Damien had sought her out quietly, without informing his council, after weeks of watching Ren's senses sharpen in ways that went beyond what any ordinary mate bond should produce. Marin examined Ren in the privacy of the palace's smaller receiving room, walking slow circles around her, occasionally pausing to study her hands, her eyes, the faint scar along her collarbone left from the night her village burned. "Tell me about your mother," Marin said finally, settling into a chair across from Ren. "She died when I was 16, Ren answered carefully. "Soldiers came to Willowmere demanding a tax we could not pay. When my father refused to hand over what little coin we had, they set fire to our home. My mother pushed me out through a back window before the roof collapsed. I never saw her again after that." "Did she ever speak of her own family?" Marin pressed gently. "Of where she came from before Willowmere?" Ren frowned, memory tugging at something she had not considered in years. She spoke sometimes of a kingdom far to the east, one that no longer exists on any map I have seen. She called it Emberlin. I always assumed it was simply a story, something from her childhood she liked to remember fondly. Marin's expression shifted, something between recognition and quiet alarm passing across her weathered features. "Emberlin was no story, child," she said. "It was a kingdom that stood for centuries before it fell to war nearly 2 decades ago, its royal bloodline believed entirely wiped out in the conflict. I had heard whispers over the years that a few survivors escaped into hiding, though I confess I never expected to meet one sitting in the Ashgrove Palace." Ren felt the blood drain from her face. "That cannot be right," she said. "My family were farmers. We had nothing. No wealth, no status. If my mother truly came from royal blood, why would she have hidden in a place like Willowmere, living in poverty for my entire childhood?" "Because hiding in poverty is far safer than living in luxury when powerful enemies believe your entire bloodline is extinct," Marin answered simply. "A hidden princess raises no questions in a farming village. A hidden princess living in comfort draws attention that could prove fatal." Damien, who had remained silent through most of the examination, finally spoke, his voice carrying a weight Ren had not heard from him before. "Emberlin fell during my father's reign," he said quietly. "I was young, but I remember the celebrations when word reached the palace that the conflict had ended in victory. I did not understand then what that victory truly meant." "What do you mean?" Ren asked, though something in his tone had already begun to fill her with dread. Marin answered before Damien could, her voice gentle but unflinching. "The Ashgrove Kingdom did not simply defeat Emberlin in that war, child. Your kingdom's father, this king's own father, led the conquest that destroyed it. The treaty that ended the conflict granted Emberlin's territory and remaining resources to the Ashgrove crown. Whatever survivors remained were absorbed quietly into the kingdom, many of them stripped of their former status and put to work as laborers, their true heritage erased from official records, to prevent any future claims to the conquered land." The room fell utterly silent. Ren stared at her own hands, trying to comprehend the sudden, staggering weight of what she was being told. If Marin's assessment was correct, then her mother had not simply been an ordinary farmer's wife hiding from misfortune. She had been royalty, a princess of a fallen kingdom, forced into hiding by the very crown that now claimed Ren as its king's fated mate. "I do not understand," Ren finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If my mother was truly from Emberlin's royal line, why would fate bind me to the son of the man who destroyed everything she once knew?" "Fate does not concern itself with politics," Marin said. "It concerns itself with balance. Perhaps this bond exists precisely because of what happened between your 2 bloodlines, not despite it. The old texts speak of bonds forming across broken histories as a means of healing wounds too old and too deep for ordinary diplomacy to mend." Damien rose from his seat, pacing slowly toward the tall window overlooking the palace grounds, his shoulders tense with something Ren could not quite name. "My father built much of this kingdom's current wealth on the conquest of Emberlin," he said quietly, more to himself than to either woman in the room. "I have spent 6 years ruling over the results of that conquest, without ever fully understanding what it cost the people who once called that land home." Ren watched him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of the arrogance or dismissiveness she had expected from a king whose family had caused so much suffering. Instead, she found only a quiet, growing horror, the look of a man, realizing the true weight of an inheritance he had never chosen, but now had to carry regardless. "I need proof," Ren said finally, forcing herself back to practical matters rather than the overwhelming grief threatening to surface. "If this is true, I want more than an old healer's suspicion. I want to know for certain who my mother truly was." Merrin nodded slowly. "There may be a way," she said. Emberlin's royal bloodline carried a distinctive mark, a small crescent-shaped birthmark passed down through generations, always appearing along the inside of the left wrist. If you carry it, that alone would confirm what I suspect. Ren's breath caught. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she rolled back the sleeve of her dress and turned her left wrist upward, revealing a small, pale crescent-shaped mark she had carried her entire life, without ever questioning its origin, always assuming it was simply an unremarkable birthmark, like countless others. Merrin's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Ren had already begun to suspect before the healer spoke a single word. "That is the mark," Merrin said quietly. "Child, you are the last known heir of the Emberlin royal line." The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a physical thing, pressing down on all three of them in different ways. Ren stared at the small crescent on her wrist, a mark she had carried unknowingly her entire life, evidence of a heritage stolen from her before she was even born, buried beneath years of poverty and, eventually, enslavement within the very kingdom that had orchestrated her family's downfall. "I need time to think," Ren said finally, rising from her chair on unsteady legs. "This is too much to understand all at once." "Of course," Damien said quickly, moving toward her as though to offer support, though he stopped himself before actually touching her, clearly mindful of the boundaries she had maintained since the night her eyes first changed. "Take whatever time you need. Merrin, I trust your discretion in this matter above all else." "You have it, my king," Merrin said, bowing her head respectfully. "Though I would caution you both, secrets of this magnitude rarely remain hidden for long, particularly within walls as full of watchful eyes and eager ears as this palace." Her warning proved prophetic sooner than any of them anticipated. Within days, whispers began circulating through the palace corridors, vague at first, mentions of a healer's private visit, questions about why the king had summoned an expert in old bloodlines to examine his newly claimed mate. Ren felt the shift in how people looked at her, curiosity sharpening into something closer to calculation among certain members of the court, particularly those who had previously dismissed her as nothing more than a temporary infatuation, destined to fade once the initial shock of the bond wore off. Counselor Dorena requested a private audience with Damien less than a week after Merrin's examination, and though Ren was not present for the conversation, she learned from Torin, who had grown into something of a quiet ally during her time at the palace, that the meeting had grown heated. "She knows," Torin admitted quietly one afternoon, finding Ren in the gardens where she had taken to spending increasing amounts of her time, finding a strange comfort among growing things that asked nothing of her, and judged her for nothing beyond what she chose to share with them. "Knows what exactly?" Ren asked, though dread already curled low in her stomach. "That you may carry Emberlin blood," Torin said. "I do not know how the information reached her, but Counselor Dorena has always kept extensive contacts throughout the kingdom, remnants of her family's old intelligence networks from before her appointment to the council." She raised the matter directly with His Majesty, questioning what it might mean for the kingdom's political stability if word spreads that the king's fated mate carries the bloodline of a conquered enemy. Ren felt her chest tighten with a familiar, unwelcome fear. The sense of being a piece moved across a board by forces far larger than herself, exactly the feeling she had hoped her new position within the palace might finally allow her to escape. "What did Damien say?" she asked. "He defended you," Torin said, and something in his tone suggested genuine respect for how his king had handled the confrontation. "He told Dorena that your bloodline changes nothing about the legitimacy of the bond, and that any noble who wishes to challenge your place within this kingdom will need to challenge him directly first." The words offered some small comfort, though Ren remained deeply unsettled by how quickly the palace's careful web of secrets and alliances had begun shifting around information she herself had only just learned. She thought of her mother, of the quiet strength the woman had carried through years of poverty and hiding, never once revealing the royal blood flowing through her veins even to her own daughter, protecting Ren from a truth that might have made her a target long before she ever set foot inside the Ashgrove Palace. That evening, Damien found her again in the gardens, settling onto the familiar stone bench beside her, without waiting for permission, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, a distance that would have felt impossible just weeks earlier. "Darina spoke with you," he said, and it was not entirely a question. "Torin told me," Ren admitted. "I assume the rest of the council will know soon, if they do not already." "Likely by tomorrow," Damien agreed grimly. "I will not apologize for defending your place here, Ren, regardless of what political complications it creates. But I want you to understand what you may be walking into. If word spreads beyond this palace, there will be those, both within my own council and beyond, who may view your existence as a threat to the current order this kingdom has built over the past 2 decades. "A threat," Ren repeated, something bitter creeping into her voice. "I am one girl, Damien. I have no army, no wealth, no claim beyond a bloodline I did not even know I carried until a week ago." "Bloodlines carry weight, regardless of the wealth or army behind them," Damien said quietly. "There are still scattered pockets of Emberlyn survivors throughout the Eastern Territories, communities that have quietly maintained their old traditions and resentments, despite decades of Ashgrove rule. If word spreads that a legitimate heir to their fallen kingdom now stands within these palace walls, bonded to the very throne responsible for their conquest, it could ignite tensions that have simmered unresolved for 20 years. Ren absorbed this in heavy silence, the full scope of what her heritage might mean settling over her with increasing weight. She had spent 2 years believing herself powerless, invisible, a slave girl with no future beyond servitude and survival. Now she was being told that her very existence carried the potential to reshape an entire kingdom's political landscape, whether she wanted that responsibility or not. "I never asked for any of this," she said finally, her voice small in a way that made Damien's expression soften with something close to pain. "I know," he said. "I did not ask for it either, not really. But here we are, both of us caught in something neither of us fully chose." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "For what it is worth, I do not regret it. Not the bond, not the complications, none of it. I know that is not what you want to hear, but it is true regardless." Ren looked at him then, really looked, taking in the tired lines around his eyes, the genuine concern in his expression that had nothing to do with political calculation, and everything to do with something far more personal than either of them had been willing to name outright. Something in her chest ached in response, a warmth she had spent weeks trying desperately to suppress, unwilling to trust feelings that had emerged from circumstances so far beyond her control. "I am not ready to say the same," she admitted honestly. "But I do not hate you either. Not anymore. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Damien said, and the quiet sincerity in his voice lingered between them, long after the conversation moved to safer, gentler topics. The two of them sitting together beneath the darkening evening sky, while somewhere within the palace walls, the machinery of court politics continued turning, indifferent to the fragile, uncertain connection, slowly building between a fallen kingdom's last heir and the son of the man who had destroyed everything her family once knew. Far to the north, within the private study of her family's estate, Serafina finally uncovered the proof she had been searching for, through weeks of careful investigation. A ledger, hidden among her father's private papers, detailed payments made to a traveling herbalist in the months leading up to her binding ceremony with Damien, payments explicitly labeled for the acquisition of rare suppressant oils used in ancient bonding rituals. Her hands trembled as she read the entries, the careful, damning record of her own father's manipulation, laid bare in his own precise handwriting. He had suppressed whatever natural bond might have formed, or failed to form, between herself and Damien, ensuring the political marriage proceeded regardless of what fate might have otherwise decided, all to secure her family's influence within the crown. Ophelia found her sitting motionless in the study long after midnight, the damning ledger still open before her, candlelight flickering across a face that had cycled through shock, grief, and finally a cold, focused fury that Ophelia had never before witnessed in her gentle mistress. "My lady," Ophelia said carefully, "what will you do with this information?" Serafina closed the ledger slowly, her expression settling into something resolute and dangerous in equal measure. "I will make certain," she said quietly, "that my father answers for what he has done, and I will discover exactly how deep this deception runs, no matter what it costs either of us." Outside, the wind howled against the estate's tall windows, carrying with it the distant promise of a storm that would soon sweep across the entire kingdom, one that had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with truths, too long buried beginning, finally, to surface. The festival of the harvest moon arrived 3 weeks later, a tradition older than the Ashgrove crown itself, when the entire kingdom gathered within the palace grounds to celebrate the closing of the growing season. Lanterns strung between ancient oak trees cast warm golden light across the gathered crowds. Musicians filled the air with lively tunes, and for one night, the rigid formalities of court life gave way to something closer to genuine celebration. Wren had been reluctant to attend, uncertain how the wider kingdom would receive her now that whispers of her Emberlin heritage had spread well beyond the palace walls. But Damien had insisted gently that hiding away would only fuel further speculation, and so she found herself standing at his side, for the first time, in a public setting, dressed in deep green silk that Ellen had helped her choose, her golden eyes catching the lantern light in a way that drew stares from every direction. To her surprise, the reception proved far warmer than she had anticipated. Many among the common folk, farmers and merchants and laborers who had themselves suffered under years of heavy taxation and harsh policy, seemed to view her rise with something closer to hope than resentment, a quiet symbol that even the most powerless among them might yet find unexpected fortune. Children approached shyly, curious about her golden eyes, while older women offered blessings and small gifts, tokens of good fortune pressed into her hands with warm, genuine smiles. It was different among the nobility, however, whose polite smiles never quite reached their calculating eyes, and Wren remained acutely aware of the careful distance many kept, watching her interactions with Damien as though searching for weaknesses to exploit. The trouble began just past midnight, when the celebratory atmosphere shattered without warning. A commotion erupted near the eastern gate, shouts and the clash of steel cutting through the festive music, and within moments, palace guards were rushing past in organized formation, faces grim with sudden alarm. Damien's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the warm, relaxed man who had spent the evening at Wren's side, transforming immediately into the commanding king the kingdom knew and feared. "Stay close to Torin," he ordered Wren firmly, already moving toward the source of the disturbance. "Do not leave his sight." "What is happening?" Wren demanded, fear coiling tight in her chest. "I do not know yet," Damien admitted. "But I intend to find out." He disappeared into the chaos before she could argue further, and Torin immediately positioned himself protectively at her side, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as he scanned the panicked crowd for any sign of immediate danger. The truth emerged slowly over the following hour, pieced together from frantic reports delivered by breathless guards. A group of armed men, believed to be mercenaries, hired by parties unknown, had attempted to breach the eastern gate under cover of the festival's chaos, apparently intent on reaching the palace's private chambers. The attack had been repelled, though not without casualties among the palace guard, and the attackers who survived had been captured for questioning. Councillor Dorena, Wren learned, had been found dead in her private study during the confusion, her body discovered by a startled servant sent to fetch her during the initial alarm. The manner of her death suggested she had been silenced deliberately, likely by someone within her own circle of contacts, who feared what she might reveal under the mounting pressure of the unfolding crisis. Wren sat in stunned silence within the safety of the palace's inner chambers, as the full scope of the night's events slowly came into focus. This was no longer simply a matter of court gossip and political maneuvering. Someone within the kingdom, someone with resources and reach extending well beyond ordinary noble rivalries, was willing to kill in order to control the unfolding situation surrounding her presence within the palace. Damien returned near dawn, exhaustion and barely contained fury etched into every line of his face. He found Wren still awake, sitting near the window of her chambers, watching the first gray light of morning creep across the palace grounds, where servants had already begun the grim work of clearing away evidence of the night's violence. "The captured mercenaries have been questioned," he said without preamble, settling heavily into the chair beside her. "They claim to have been hired through an intermediary, No direct name given, though the payment they received traces back to accounts connected with Lord Hensworth's estate. Wren's breath caught. Serafina's father, she said quietly. Damien nodded grimly. It appears Dorena was working with Hensworth all along, feeding him information about your Emberlyn heritage and the growing instability it threatens to cause. Whether she intended betrayal or simply grew too valuable a liability once her usefulness ran its course, I cannot yet say for certain. But someone silenced her before she could be questioned further, and that same someone attempted to use tonight's chaos as cover for something far more dangerous. An attempt on my life, Wren said, the words feeling strange and unreal even as she spoke them aloud. Or on mine, Damien admitted. Or perhaps both of us together. The investigation continues, but I will not rest until I understand the full scope of what we are facing. Before either of them could discuss the matter further, an urgent knock interrupted, and Torin entered looking pale and shaken, a rolled parchment clutched tightly in his hand. "My king," he said. "A message arrived just now, delivered by a rider claiming to represent Lady Serafina directly. She requests an immediate audience, alone, regarding matters she describes as, and I quote her words precisely, matters of grave importance to the true stability of this kingdom." Damien's expression hardened further as he took the parchment, scanning its contents quickly, before passing it wordlessly to Wren. The message was brief but unmistakable in its urgency. Serafina, requesting a private meeting at the earliest possible hour, hinting at evidence she had uncovered that implicated her own father in crimes far more extensive than anyone within the palace yet understood. "I need to see her," Damien said finally. "I will come with you," Wren said immediately, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Damien hesitated. "Wren, after tonight, I cannot guarantee your safety outside these walls. I have spent 2 years surviving in far more dangerous circumstances than a private meeting with your former Luna," Wren said firmly. "Whatever she has uncovered involves me directly. I will not hide in these chambers while my own future is decided by others once again." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant respect flickering behind his tired golden eyes, before finally nodding in agreement. They departed within the hour, a small, carefully chosen guard, escorting them toward the modest estate on the palace outskirts, where Serafina had arranged their meeting, a neutral location, chosen deliberately away from both the palace and her father's northern holdings. Serafina herself waited within a simply furnished sitting room, looking pale but resolute, a leather-bound ledger resting on the table before her. "Thank you for coming," Serafina said as they entered, her eyes moving briefly to Wren, before returning to Damien, her expression carefully controlled despite the obvious tension underlying every word. "I would not have summoned you under these circumstances if the matter were not urgent." "What have you found?" Damien asked, settling into the chair across from her, while Wren remained standing near the door, unsure of her welcome, in a room still thick with the weight of unresolved history between the two former spouses. Serafina slid the ledger across the table. "Proof," she said quietly, "that our bond, or rather the absence of one, was never a matter of fate at all. My father suppressed whatever connection might have formed between us, through the use of ancient bonding oils during our binding ceremony, ensuring our marriage proceeded as planned, regardless of what our wolves might have otherwise chosen." Damien's expression darkened as he examined the ledger's contents, the careful record of payments and ingredients laid bare in Lord Hensworth's own precise handwriting. "This explains much," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But it does not explain tonight's attack, nor Dorena's death. It explains more than you realize," Serafina said. "My father has grown increasingly desperate since your public rejection of our bond, Damien. His political influence within the court depended heavily on my position as Luna. When that position collapsed, so too did much of the leverage he had spent years carefully building. I believe he has grown willing to take increasingly drastic measures to reclaim what he views as rightfully his family's influence, including, I fear, orchestrating tonight's violence in an attempt to eliminate the source of his current troubles." "You believe your own father tried to have us killed?" Wren asked quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Serafina turned to face her directly, and for a long moment, old resentment flickered visibly behind her eyes, before something more complicated, closer to weary resignation, replaced it. "I believe my father cares more for power than for the well-being of his own daughter," she said honestly. I have spent the past weeks uncovering the full extent of his manipulations, and what I have found troubles me deeply enough that I am willing to work against him directly, regardless of what that means for my own family's future standing. Why come to us with this information? Damien asked. You could have simply disappeared, built a new life away from all of this. Because I refuse to remain a pawn in games, orchestrated by men who never once asked what I actually wanted, Serafina said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I was raised from childhood to believe my only value lay in securing an advantageous marriage. I spent 3 years pretending contentment I never truly felt, all because my father decided my future before I was old enough to have any say in the matter. I will not spend the rest of my life as a tool for his ambitions, regardless of what comes next for me personally. Ren felt something unexpected shift within her chest as she listened, a grudging understanding beginning to form, despite months of resentment toward the woman whose position she had unknowingly inherited. Serafina, too, it seemed, had been a victim of circumstances entirely beyond her own control, trapped within expectations and manipulations orchestrated by men who valued her only for the political advantages her bloodline and position could provide. I am sorry, Ren said quietly, surprising herself with the sincerity of the words. For the way you were treated, both by your father and by the circumstances that led to your public humiliation. None of that was fair to you. Serafina's composure cracked slightly at the unexpected kindness, something raw and vulnerable flickering across her features, before she carefully rebuilt her guarded expression. Thank you, she said softly. That means more than you likely realize. Damien studied both women for a long moment before finally speaking again, his tone shifting into something more decisive and pragmatic. We need proof beyond this ledger, he said. Evidence solid enough to bring formal charges against your father, Serafina, and to expose whatever network of corruption Darina was operating within before her death. I have already begun gathering additional evidence, Serafina said. My father grows more careless in his desperation. If we act quickly, before he realizes how much I have already uncovered, we may be able to expose the full extent of his schemes before he can orchestrate further violence. The three of them spent the following hours deep in careful planning, an unlikely alliance forming between a rejected Luna, a fallen kingdom's last heir, and the king caught between them, all three now bound together by a shared determination to expose the corruption threatening to tear the kingdom apart from within. Whatever personal history and complicated emotions still lingered between them, each recognized the greater danger now facing all of them, a threat that demanded cooperation regardless of past grievances. As dawn broke fully over the horizon, casting warm light across the modest sitting room, where former enemies had cautiously begun forging new understanding, Ren found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had transformed in the span of just a few short weeks. She had arrived at this meeting prepared for confrontation, for the lingering resentment she had assumed Serafina still carried toward her. Instead, she had found an unexpected ally, a woman equally trapped by circumstances beyond her control, equally determined to reclaim agency over a future that had been decided for her by powerful men who valued political advantage over genuine human welfare. The road ahead remained dangerous and uncertain. Lord Hensworth's full intentions still unclear, the network of corruption surrounding Darina's death still largely unexposed, and the looming threat of further violence hanging heavy over all of them. But for the first time since her eyes had turned gold in that crowded throne room, Ren felt something closer to genuine hope taking root within her chest, a growing sense that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would not be forced to face them entirely alone. 2 weeks passed in careful, quiet investigation, each day bringing Serafina's alliance with Damien and Ren closer to the evidence they needed. Working through trusted contacts within her father's household staff, people who had grown weary of Lord Hensworth's increasingly erratic and cruel behavior over the years, Serafina managed to obtain copies of correspondence between her father and a network of disgruntled nobles who had quietly opposed the crown's policies for years, resentful of taxation and territorial decisions made without sufficient regard for their own interests. The letters revealed a plot far more extensive than any of them had initially suspected. Lord Hensworth had not acted alone in orchestrating the attack during the Harvest Festival, nor in silencing Councillor Darina once her usefulness as an informant had run its course. He had spent months building a coalition of powerful families, all united by shared grievances against Damien's rule, all willing to support a direct challenge to the crown itself, should the opportunity present itself. The timing of this attempted uprising, Serafina explained one evening as the three of them gathered in the same modest sitting room where their alliance had first formed, was no coincidence. My father saw your rejection of me as an opportunity, a moment of perceived weakness he could exploit to rally support against your rule. Ren's Emberlin heritage only sharpened his resolve, giving him a rallying point to convince other nobles that the crown itself had grown unstable, unfit to maintain the current order. Damien's expression remained grim as he studied the gathered evidence spread across the table before them: correspondence, financial records, and testimony gathered from increasingly cooperative household staff who had grown disillusioned with Lord Hensworth's methods. "This is enough," he said finally. "Enough to bring formal charges, enough to expose the full network before they can act further." "We need to move carefully," Serafina cautioned. "My father still commands significant loyalty among certain factions of the northern nobility. If we act too openly, too quickly, we risk pushing his allies into open rebellion rather than allowing the evidence to speak for itself through proper channels." Ren, who had spent the past 2 weeks not only assisting in the investigation, but also continuing her own quiet exploration of what her Emberlin heritage truly meant, found herself increasingly drawn into conversations about the kingdom's broader political landscape. Conversations she would have found utterly foreign just weeks earlier, when she had been nothing more than an invisible servant scrubbing palace floors. "What of the remaining Emberlin communities?" she asked, the question that had been building in her mind for days finally finding voice. Marin mentioned scattered survivors, still living quietly throughout the eastern territories. If word of my heritage continues spreading, as it inevitably will, how will they respond? "That depends entirely on how this crisis resolves," Damien said carefully. "If Lord Hensworth's rebellion succeeds in destabilizing the kingdom, or if word spreads that I have failed to protect you or acknowledge your heritage appropriately, it could reignite old tensions that have simmered unresolved for 2 decades. But if we handle this correctly, if justice is seen to be done, and your heritage properly honored rather than exploited, it could instead become a genuine step toward healing wounds this kingdom has long ignored." The weight of that responsibility settled heavily over Ren in the days that followed, a growing awareness that whatever choices lay ahead of her carried consequences reaching far beyond her own personal circumstances. She was no longer simply a slave girl caught in an unexpected fated bond, nor even simply the last heir of a fallen kingdom trying to understand her own stolen heritage. She had become, whether she wanted the role or not, a symbol around which an entire kingdom's future stability now seemed to turn. The confrontation finally came on a stormy evening, nearly 3 weeks after the Harvest Festival attack, when word reached the palace that Lord Hensworth had gathered his allied forces at the northern border, preparing to march on the capital, under the pretense of demanding justice for his daughter's public humiliation, though the true motivations behind the mobilization were far more ambitious than mere personal grievance. Damien called an emergency council session, presenting the accumulated evidence of Hensworth's treason before the full assembly of remaining nobles, many of whom had grown increasingly uneasy over the preceding weeks, as rumors of the plot circulated through careful, deliberate channels Serafina herself had helped orchestrate to prepare the ground for this exact moment. "The evidence is undeniable," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the tense council chamber as he laid out the correspondence, the financial records, the testimony of witnesses willing to speak against Hensworth's schemes. "Lord Hensworth has conspired to destabilize this kingdom through violence, has orchestrated the murder of a sitting councillor, and now marches an armed force toward this very capital under false pretenses. I will not allow such treason to stand unanswered." Several nobles who had privately sympathized with Hensworth's grievances shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recalculating their allegiances in light of evidence far more damning than the vague political dissatisfaction that had initially drawn some of them toward his cause. Others, who had remained loyal to the crown throughout the unfolding crisis, voiced immediate support for decisive action against the approaching threat. "What of Lady Serafina?" one older nobleman asked carefully. "Does she stand with her father in this treason, or against him?" Serafina rose from her seat near the back of the chamber, where where she had remained quietly present throughout the proceedings, her presence itself a carefully calculated statement of where her loyalties now firmly rested. "I stand against my father's treason," she said clearly, her voice steady, despite the obvious difficulty of publicly denouncing her own family. "I have provided the evidence gathered here today, at considerable personal cost, precisely because I refuse to allow his ambitions to plunge this kingdom into needless conflict. Whatever judgment falls upon him, I accept that it falls upon a man who chose treason over the well-being of the people he claims to represent." The declaration sent a ripple of surprised murmurs through the assembled council, many nobles clearly reassessing their understanding of the rejected Luna who had, until this moment, remained largely absent from public palace life since her humiliating dismissal months earlier. Ren, watching from where she stood near Damien's side, felt a fresh wave of respect for the woman whose position she had unknowingly inherited, recognizing the immense courage required to publicly turn against one's own father, regardless of how thoroughly that father's actions had justified such a stance. The council's decision, once deliberation concluded, was swift and decisive. Forces would be mobilized to intercept Lord Hensworth's advance before it could reach the capital, while formal charges of treason and conspiracy to murder would be prepared for his eventual capture and trial. Damien himself would lead the response personally, a decision that filled Ren with immediate visceral alarm, despite her growing understanding of the political necessity behind such a show of direct royal leadership. "You cannot go yourself," she said, later that evening, finding him alone in his private study. Maps of the Northern Territories spread across his desk as he finalized preparations for the coming confrontation. "I must," Damien said gently, though his expression softened at the obvious concern in her voice. "This kingdom needs to see its king standing firmly against treason, not hiding safely within palace walls while others risk their lives on his behalf. It is a matter of both practical necessity and symbolic importance." Ren crossed the room, stopping close enough that the familiar pull of the bond hummed warmly between them, a sensation she had stopped fighting against weeks ago, even if she had not yet found the words to name exactly what it meant to her. "I have already lost one family to violence I could not prevent," she said quietly. "I do not wish to lose another." Damien's expression shifted at her words, something raw and hopeful flickering behind his tired golden eyes, at the implicit admission buried within her statement. The first time she had spoken so directly of considering him, considering this bond, as something approaching family, rather than simply an unwanted obligation, thrust upon her by forces beyond her control. "You will not lose me," he said softly, reaching out slowly to take her hand, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she chose. This time, she did not. "I promise you that, Ren. Whatever comes in the days ahead, I intend to return to you." The forces departed at dawn the following morning, Damien, at their head astride a powerful black warhorse, his expression carrying the same commanding intensity Ren remembered from that first fateful night in the throne room, though now tempered by something gentler that had grown steadily between them over the preceding weeks. She watched from the palace's highest balcony as the column of soldiers wound its way through the capital's streets and out toward the Northern Territories, her heart heavy with worry, despite her growing confidence in Damien's ability to handle whatever confrontation awaited him. The following days passed in agonizing uncertainty, sparse messenger reports trickling back to the palace with updates on the unfolding confrontation. Lord Hensworth's forces, upon realizing the extent of evidence gathered against him and witnessing the size of the royal response mobilized to meet his advance, began fracturing almost immediately. Allied nobles reconsidering their commitment to a rebellion, clearly destined to fail against such overwhelming preparation and legitimate cause. The final confrontation, when it came, proved almost anticlimactic compared to the weeks of tension building toward it. Faced with the collapse of his coalition and the undeniable weight of evidence against him, Lord Hensworth surrendered without significant bloodshed, his remaining loyal forces laying down arms rather than facing the full might of the royal army, in a battle they had no realistic hope of winning. Damien returned to the capital 8 days after his departure, Lord Hensworth bound and under heavy guard among the returning column, the immediate threat of rebellion successfully neutralized without the extensive violence and loss of life that might have resulted had the confrontation escalated into full battle. Ren was waiting when the column finally passed through the capital's gates, unable to contain her relief as she watched Damien dismount, and immediately searched the gathered crowd, until his eyes found hers. She did not wait for formal protocol, or careful consideration of appropriate public behavior. She crossed the distance between them at a near run, and Damien met her halfway, pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of the fear and relief, and growing affection, neither of them had yet found the courage to fully name. "You came back," she said quietly against his shoulder. "I told you I would," he answered, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide from the watching crowd. The trial of Lord Hensworth followed swiftly, evidence presented before the full council leaving little room for doubt regarding his guilt in orchestrating both the Harvest Festival attack and Councillor Dorena's murder. He was stripped of his title and lands, his fate ultimately left to formal judgment that would see him imprisoned for the remainder of his life, his surviving allies among the northern nobility facing lesser but still significant consequences for their participation in the failed conspiracy. Serafina, whose crucial assistance in exposing her father's treason had not gone unnoticed by the wider kingdom, found herself viewed with newfound respect among the very court that had witnessed her public humiliation months earlier. Rather than the pity or scorn she might once have feared, she instead earned genuine admiration for the courage required to choose justice over familial loyalty, a reputation that would serve her well as she began quietly considering what shape her own future, now finally free from her father's manipulative influence, might take. For Ren and Damien, the successful resolution of the crisis marked a turning point neither had fully anticipated when their unlikely bond first formed in that crowded throne room months earlier. What had begun as confusion and resentment, complicated further by revelations of stolen heritage and political conspiracy, had gradually transformed into something neither of them had expected to find amid such turbulent circumstances, a genuine partnership built not merely on the mysterious pull of fate, but on shared trust earned through weeks of navigating danger and uncertainty together. Yet even as one crisis resolved, Ren remained acutely aware that larger questions still loomed unanswered ahead of her. Her Emberlyn heritage, now widely known throughout the kingdom, carried implications far beyond the immediate political crisis they had just weathered. Somewhere in the Eastern Territories, scattered communities of Emberlyn survivors still lived quietly in the shadow of the kingdom that had conquered their homeland, and Ren knew, with growing certainty, that her own path forward would eventually require confronting that broader legacy directly, deciding what role, if any, she wished to play in healing wounds that had remained open for 20 long years. Spring arrived slowly across the Ashgrove kingdom, the harsh grip of winter finally loosening its hold as green shoots pushed through soil that had spent months frozen and dormant. Within the palace, life had settled into a rhythm none of its inhabitants could have predicted a year earlier, the aftermath of Lord Hensworth's failed rebellion gradually giving way to a period of careful rebuilding and reform that touched every corner of the kingdom's governance. Ren had spent the winter months immersed in learning, determined to understand not only the heritage she had so unexpectedly discovered, but also the broader responsibilities that now seemed to follow inevitably from her position within the palace. Meryn had remained at court through the coldest months, tutoring her in the old traditions and history of Emberlyn, patient lessons that gradually transformed abstract knowledge of a lost kingdom into something Ren began to feel genuine connection toward, a heritage she was slowly learning to claim rather than simply endure. "You carry yourself differently now," Damien observed one afternoon, finding her in the palace library surrounded by stacks of old texts, her golden eyes moving quickly across pages of Emberlyn history that would have meant nothing to her just months earlier. Ren looked up, offering him a small, genuine smile that had become increasingly natural between them over the preceding months. "I feel different," she admitted. "For most of my life, I understood myself only in terms of what I had lost, my family, my home, my freedom. Learning about Emberlyn has given me something else to understand myself through, a heritage that existed long before the fire that took everything else from me." Damien settled into the chair across from her, close enough now that the distance between them felt entirely natural, rather than the carefully maintained boundary it had once been. "Have you decided what you wish to do about the surviving Emberlyn communities?" he asked gently, a question that had hovered unspoken between them for weeks, as Ren processed the full weight of her discovered heritage. "I have been thinking of little else," Ren admitted. "Meryn tells me there are perhaps 3 or 4 settlements scattered through the Eastern Territories, Communities that have maintained old traditions quietly for 2 decades, careful not to draw attention that might prove dangerous. I want to visit them, Damien. I want to see what remains of the world my mother left behind, and I want them to know that their heritage has not been entirely erased, that someone still carries their bloodline forward. That will require careful planning, Damien said thoughtfully. Given the recent unrest surrounding Hensworth's rebellion, I would want to ensure your safety throughout any such journey, though I understand and support the importance of what you are proposing. I do not wish to travel as a symbol of Ashgrove authority imposing itself on communities that have every reason to distrust this crown, Wren said carefully. I want to go as myself, as Emberlin's last heir seeking to understand her own people, not as your consort making a political statement. Damien considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then perhaps a smaller escort would serve better than a formal royal procession, he said. Enough protection to ensure your safety, but not so much that it feels like an occupying force descending upon communities already wary of outside authority. The journey east began in earnest as spring fully bloomed across the kingdom, Wren traveling with a modest escort that included Torin, whose steady presence had become a genuine comfort over the preceding months, along with Merrin, whose knowledge of Emberlin's old customs and geography proved invaluable in locating the scattered communities that had survived quietly in the shadow of their conquered homeland's memory. The first settlement they encountered, a small farming community nestled within a hidden valley some distance from the nearest major road, greeted their arrival with initial wariness that gradually transformed into something closer to cautious wonder once Merrin explained the purpose of their visit. An elderly woman, clearly recognized as something of a community leader despite the settlement's otherwise egalitarian appearance, approached slowly, studying Wren's face with an intensity that made her feel suddenly, acutely vulnerable. You have her eyes, the woman said finally, her voice thick with an emotion Wren could not immediately place. Before they turned gold, I mean. I remember your mother, child. I remember the day she left, carrying you as an infant, determined to find safety somewhere the Ashgrove crown would never think to look. Wren's breath caught. You knew my mother, she asked, hardly daring to believe the words even as she spoke them. I knew her well, the woman answered, tears gathering in her eyes despite her obvious effort to remain composed. She was our princess, child, beloved by every family in this valley, before the war took everything from us. When word reached her that her own family had fallen in the final battles, she knew she could not remain, not with an infant to protect, and enemies who might yet seek to eliminate any remaining threat to their conquest. She left with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the child she was determined to keep safe, no matter the cost. The story that unfolded over the following hours, shared by an elderly woman who had once served as handmaiden to Wren's own grandmother, filled in details of Wren's heritage that Merrin's earlier lessons had only begun to sketch. Her mother, it emerged, had been considered one of Emberlin's most beloved royal daughters, known throughout the kingdom for her compassion and genuine care for the common people, qualities that had made her flight into hiding all the more painful for the communities left behind, mourning both their fallen kingdom and the loss of a princess many had hoped might someday help rebuild what the war had destroyed. Wren listened with tears streaming freely down her face, finally understanding the full weight of sacrifice her mother had carried silently throughout her difficult life in Willowmere, choosing years of poverty and anonymity over the dangers that might have followed, had she remained visible as Emberlin's last legitimate heir. The mother she had known only as a quiet farmer's wife, gentle and hard-working despite the hardships of their circumstances, had once been beloved royalty who sacrificed everything, including the comfort and recognition she deserved, to keep her daughter safe. She would be proud of you, the elderly woman said gently, noticing Wren's obvious grief. Proud that you have found your way home, even after everything that was taken from both of you. Over the following weeks, Wren visited each of the scattered Emberlin communities in turn, gathering stories and memories that gradually painted a fuller picture of the heritage she had spent her entire life unknowingly carrying. She learned old songs her mother had never taught her, likely out of fear that such traditions might draw unwanted attention during their years in hiding. She learned of customs and celebrations that had once defined Emberlin's culture, before the war stripped it all away, traditions the surviving communities had maintained quietly, despite decades of enforced silence about their true origins. Word of her journey inevitably began spreading beyond the immediate communities she visited, and Ren found herself increasingly approached by representatives from Ashgrove settlements as well, curious about the growing stories of Emberlin's last heir, traveling openly through the Eastern Territories for the first time in 20 years. Rather than the hostility she had half feared might greet such attention, she found instead a complicated mixture of curiosity, cautious hope, and genuine interest in what her presence might mean for relations between the two long-divided populations. Damien, kept informed through regular messenger reports throughout her journey, made the decision to formally announce a new policy initiative upon her eventual return to the capital, one aimed at recognizing and protecting the rights of Emberlin's surviving communities, ensuring their cultural traditions could be practiced openly, rather than in the careful secrecy that had defined their existence for the preceding 2 decades. "This is not merely a gesture toward you personally, Ren," he explained when he first proposed the initiative to her upon her return, though genuine affection remained evident beneath the careful policy language he used. "This kingdom's stability has long depended on suppressing rather than healing old wounds from the Emberlin conquest. Your journey has shown me that continued suppression serves no one well, least of all a kingdom that claims to value justice and unity among all its people." Ren, who had returned from her journey, transformed in ways that went beyond simply the knowledge she had gained about her heritage, found herself deeply moved by Damien's genuine commitment to addressing wrongs his own family's rule had perpetuated. The nervous, uncertain slave girl who had first stood frozen in a crowded throne room months earlier had gradually given way to someone far more confident in her own identity and purpose, a transformation that had not gone unnoticed by the wider court, many of whom now regarded her with genuine respect rather than the wary curiosity or open hostility that had characterized her earliest weeks within palace walls. The formal announcement of the new Emberlin recognition policy took place during a carefully planned ceremony held in the same throne room where Ren's golden eyes had first revealed her fated bond with Damien months earlier, a deliberate choice meant to symbolize how far both the kingdom and their own relationship had traveled since that fateful night. Representatives from each of the surviving Emberlin communities attended, alongside the full assembly of Ashgrove nobility, many of whom had grown genuinely invested in the successful resolution of tensions that had simmered unresolved for far too long. Standing beside Damien as he formally announced the new policies, protections for Emberlin cultural practices, formal acknowledgement of the conquest's historical wrongs, and the establishment of a council seat specifically reserved for Emberlin community representation within the broader Ashgrove government, Ren felt a profound sense of purpose she had never imagined possible during her years as an invisible, powerless slave. The fire that had taken her family and her childhood home had ultimately led her, through circumstances neither predictable nor entirely welcome at the time, toward a position where she could help ensure such wrongs were finally, properly addressed. After the ceremony concluded, as the gathered crowd slowly dispersed and the formal business of the day gave way to quieter celebration, Damien found Ren standing alone, near the same window where he had first watched her the previous autumn, back when neither of them had understood what their unexpected bond might eventually come to mean. "You have changed this kingdom," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "We have changed it together," she corrected gently, turning to face him, with an openness in her expression that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "I could not have found the courage for any of this without your support, Damien. Whatever this bond means, whatever fate intended when my eyes changed that night, I am grateful for it now in ways I never expected to be." Damien's expression softened into something achingly tender, and for the first time since the bond had first manifested between them, he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, before gently cupping her face in his hands. "And I am grateful for you," he said quietly, "not simply because fate decided we belong together, but because of who you have proven yourself to be, throughout everything these past months have demanded of us both." Ren did not step back. Instead, she leaned into his touch, finally allowing herself to fully embrace what had grown steadily between them since that chaotic first night, no longer resisting feelings she had spent months carefully guarding against, uncertain whether trust could ever truly bloom from such complicated, painful beginnings. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, questions of formal titles and lasting policy, the ongoing work of healing generations of division between two kingdoms once torn apart by war and conquest, Ren finally allowed herself to believe that she and Damien would face them together, partners bound not merely by the mysterious pull of fate, but by genuine trust and affection, earned through months of navigating impossible circumstances side by side. A full year had passed since the night gold first bloomed across Wren's eyes in a crowded throne room, and the Ashgrove kingdom, that prepared for the coronation ceremony, now looked, in many ways, quite different from the kingdom that had watched a slave girl transform a king's entire understanding of fate and duty in a single unexpected moment. The reforms that followed the formal recognition of Emberlin's surviving communities had rippled outward through the kingdom in ways few had initially anticipated. Old tensions that had simmered unresolved for 2 decades began, slowly and carefully, to heal, as Emberlin traditions found space to flourish openly for the first time since the conquest, and communities that had once viewed each other with suspicion born of old conflict gradually discovered shared interests and growing mutual respect. The council seat established for Emberlin representation had proven a genuine success, bringing perspectives and concerns to royal governance that had long been ignored or actively suppressed. Seraphina, freed entirely from her father's manipulative influence and the political marriage that had never truly reflected her own wishes, had spent the preceding months building an unexpected new role for herself within the kingdom's rebuilding efforts. Her intimate knowledge of court politics and her demonstrated courage in exposing her own father's treason had earned her genuine respect, and she had gradually taken on responsibilities coordinating the kingdom's broader diplomatic outreach, work that suited her considerable talents far better than the largely ceremonial role of Luna ever had. She arrived at the palace 3 days before the coronation, having been formally invited by both Damien and Wren, a gesture that had initially surprised many among the court, who still remembered the dramatic circumstances of her earlier dismissal. Wren met her in the palace gardens, the same gardens where so much of her own transformation had unfolded over the preceding year, and the two women, once positioned as rivals by circumstances entirely beyond their control, greeted each other now with the easy familiarity of genuine friendship, earned through months of shared struggle against a common threat. "You look well," Wren said warmly, taking in Seraphina's confident bearing, so different from the carefully controlled composure she had maintained during their earliest, more difficult encounters. "I am well," Seraphina said, and something in her voice carried genuine conviction, rather than mere polite assurance. "Freer than I have felt in years, if I am honest. I never realized how much of myself I had suppressed, simply to fulfill expectations that were never truly my own." "I am glad," Wren said sincerely. "You deserve happiness built on your own terms, Seraphina, not obligations forced upon you by others." "As do you," Seraphina replied, glancing meaningfully toward the palace where Damien could be seen through a distant window, deep in final preparations for the coronation ceremony that would formally recognize Wren's position not merely as his fated mate, but as Emberlin's rightful heir, and, following the ceremony, as Ashgrove's Luna in her own right, a title she had once firmly rejected, but had gradually come to embrace as her understanding of her own place within the kingdom's future had deepened and matured. The coronation itself unfolded with a scale and formality that would have seemed impossible to imagine during Wren's earliest uncertain weeks within the palace, when she had insisted so firmly against any public ceremony or formal title. But the woman who stood now in the same throne room where her transformation had first begun bore little resemblance to the frightened, uncertain slave girl of a year earlier. She had grown into her role gradually, deliberately, choosing at each step to embrace the responsibilities and opportunities her unexpected fate had presented, rather than simply enduring them as circumstances beyond her control. Representatives from every corner of the kingdom filled the grand hall. Common folk and nobility alike gathered to witness the formal crowning of a Luna, whose story had become something close to legend throughout the preceding year. A slave girl, who had discovered herself to be a fallen kingdom's last heir, who had helped expose treason and prevent civil war, and who had ultimately guided her adopted kingdom toward genuine healing of wounds, decades in the making. Marin, who had remained a constant and valued presence at court throughout the preceding year, stood ready to perform the ancient ceremonial rites that would formally join the crowns of Ashgrove and Emberlin heritage, a symbolic union that carried far greater meaning than any political marriage could have achieved on its own. As Wren knelt before Damien in the ceremony's culminating moment, her golden eyes meeting his with an openness and genuine affection that had grown steadily throughout their shared journey, the assembled crowd erupted in genuine, heartfelt celebration that echoed through the palace and out across the surrounding capital. "Rise, Luna of Ashgrove, heir of Emberlin," Damien said, his voice carrying clear and strong through the hushed hall, formal ceremonial language giving way, in the final words, to something far more personal and heartfelt. "Rise, and stand beside me, not merely as fate decreed, but as the woman I have chosen with my whole heart, again and again, throughout everything this past year has demanded of us both." Ren rose, and the kiss that followed met with thunderous approval from the gathered crowd, sealed not merely a formal political ceremony, but a genuine partnership built through months of shared struggle, growing trust, and hard-won mutual respect between two people who had never expected fate to bring them together, yet who had ultimately discovered something far more valuable than the simple mystical bond that had first drawn them into each other's orbit. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the palace grounds as representatives from both Ashgrove and Emberlin communities mingled freely, sharing food and traditions that would once have seemed impossible to imagine occurring together in genuine harmony. Ren moved through the crowds with an ease and confidence that spoke to how thoroughly she had grown into her new position, pausing to speak warmly with common folk and nobility alike, her genuine care for the well-being of all her people evident in every interaction. Late in the evening, as the formal celebrations began winding down and the palace grounds grew quieter, beneath a sky full of bright stars, Ren found herself once again in the familiar palace gardens, this time with Damien at her side, both of them finally free from the demands of ceremony and public duty that had filled the preceding days. "Do you remember," she said quietly, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed so much of their difficult, transformative journey together, "how frightened I was that first night? I thought my life had simply traded one kind of powerlessness for another, a slave girl thrust into a fate she never chose or wanted." "I remember," Damien said softly, taking her hand in his, a gesture that had grown as natural and comfortable between them as breathing over the preceding months. "I was frightened too, though I hid it better than you did. Everything I understood about duty and fate and my own place as king seemed to shatter in that single moment." "And now?" Ren asked, turning to face him fully, her golden eyes bright with genuine warmth and affection that bore no resemblance to the wary uncertainty that had once defined her expression whenever she looked at him. "Now," Damien said, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, "I understand that fate did not simply hand me a mate that night. It handed me a partner capable of transforming not only my own understanding of what genuine partnership could mean, but an entire kingdom's willingness to finally confront and heal wounds we had spent decades pretending did not exist." Ren smiled, leaning into his touch with the easy trust that had grown between them through months of shared trial and genuine partnership. "We did that together," she reminded him gently, the same words she had offered him once before, words that had proven true again and again throughout their journey. "Together," Damien agreed, and the word carried within it everything they had built since that fateful night when gold first bloomed in a slave girl's eyes and changed the course of an entire kingdom forever. Above them, the stars continued their slow, eternal wheel across the night sky, indifferent witnesses to the countless small and large moments that had shaped the journey of a king and a former slave girl who had discovered, through hardship and danger, and gradual, hard-won trust, that fate's greatest gift was rarely simply the initial spark of connection, but rather everything two people chose to build together in the months and years that followed, choice by choice, day by day, until what began as an unexpected, unwanted bond had transformed into something neither of them would ever wish to live without. The kingdom of Ashgrove, healed and strengthened by the union of two peoples once divided by conquest and grief, entered a new era of genuine partnership and mutual respect, guided by a king and Luna whose own journey from suspicion and uncertainty toward deep, abiding trust and love offered a powerful example of what became possible when courage and compassion were allowed to triumph over fear, prejudice, and the weight of old, unhealed wounds. And in the palace gardens, beneath a sky full of quiet stars, Ren and Damien remained together long into the night, no longer a king and a slave girl caught in circumstances beyond their control, but two equal partners who had chosen, deliberately and completely, to build a shared future neither fate nor duty alone could ever have created on its own.